Preface. This book is more than a historical chronicle. It is a deeply personal reflection, an intellectual offering, and a timely meditation on the enduring power of the people's voice. Born and raised in the lush agricultural heartland of Idanre, a prominent cocoa-producing town in southwestern Nigeria, I grew up amid the rhythms of the land and the realities of rural economic struggle. My father, Chief Moses Adesemoye, served as the president of the Idanre Cocoa Produce and Marketing Cooperative in the early 1970s, a period marked by both opportunity and unrest. His leadership in a time of profound agricultural and political transformation shaped my earliest understanding of governance, resistance, and the vital role of grassroots organization. With a first degree in agricultural economics earned in the early 1980s, I pursued a lifelong journey of inquiry into the intersection of rural livelihoods, economic justice, and political accountability. This book, Agbekoya, A People's Rebellion, represents the third in a series of contributions to knowledge within a single year, offered with the humility and responsibility of one whose insights are rooted in lived proximity to the subject matter. The Agbekoya movement was not merely a tax protest or a rural uprising. It was a clarion call for dignity, equity, and responsive leadership. In chronicling the evolution of this rebellion, from its economic and cultural antecedents to its moral and political legacies, I seek to situate Agbekoya not only as a pivotal moment in Nigerian history, but also as a universal case study in participatory governance, citizen agency, and the ethics of leadership. This work is structured across 4 volumes: The Gathering Storm, The Road to Rebellion, The War of the Oppressed, Battles, Resistance, and Female Power, Wisdom and Diplomacy, Negotiating Peace, Losing Ground, From Rebellion to Reflection, Leadership Lessons for the Future. Each volume is carefully curated to reflect the movement's chronology and complexity, giving voice to the farmers, the women, the leaders, and the unseen hands of resistance. At a time when many nations continue to grapple with inequality, marginalization, and governance deficits, Agbekoya offers enduring lessons on how societies may self-correct through collective moral courage and organized action. I am privileged to present this narrative not only as a scholar and public intellectual, but as a son of the soil, a witness to history, and a steward of memory. May the story of Agbekoya rekindle our resolve to listen more attentively, govern more compassionately, and walk in the wisdom of those who tilled the land and tilled justice with equal tenacity. Adedeji Jones, Adesemoye, Abuja, Nigeria, June 2025. Now let us begin with Volume 1. Chapter 1, The Gathering Storm. This is Agbekoya, A People's Movement for Justice and Dignity, written by Adedeji Jones, Adesemoye. Copyright 2025. All rights reserved. This audiobook is produced for reflective and educational listening. Agbekoya, A People's Movement for Justice and Dignity. In a time of oppressive taxation, rural exploitation, and elite indifference, a quiet storm was rising in the farmlands of western Nigeria. Agbekoya, A People's Movement for Justice and Dignity, tells the gripping, multi-volume story of how ordinary farmers, armed not with rifles but with resilience, challenged a corrupt system and reshaped the political consciousness of a nation. This masterpiece, rich with cultural detail and dramatic insight, chronicles the grassroots uprising of the Agbekoya movement from its humble beginnings in Yoruba agrarian communities to its crescendo of resistance, negotiation, betrayal, and timeless legacy. Through vivid chapters and compelling storytelling, the book unveils secret planning, the quiet heroism of women, intelligence battles, battles, broken truces, and enduring economic struggles that mirror today's global cry for justice and equity. Structured across 4 powerful volumes, The Gathering Storm, The War of the Oppressed, Wisdom and Diplomacy, and From Rebellion to Reflection, this book offers a rare blend of historical narrative, political analysis, and leadership reflection. With universal themes of freedom, dignity, governance, empathy, and citizen voice, this book is more than history. It is a moral compass for modern leadership and a clarion call for participatory governance in Africa and beyond. What would an Agbekoya response look like today? How do we preserve people's voices in modern governance? What must African leaders and the world learn from this forgotten revolution? If you believe in the power of people to change their destiny, this book is your must-read. A bold, unforgettable, and globally relevant story. This is not just Nigeria's past, it's the world's present. Chapter 1. The Peasants and the Palace. In the early decades before and after Nigerian independence, Yoruba agrarian society formed the foundation of regional life in western Nigeria. The countryside was not merely a geographic location, but a living organism, vibrant with tradition, labor, spirituality, and resilience. The peasants, largely farmers, were custodians of a sacred social order, one that bound them not just to the soil, but to their leaders through a deeply rooted sense of communal identity and mutual obligation. But this delicate balance between the governed and the governing was not to last. As the post-colonial state expanded and the quest for modernization intensified, the needs and voices of the rural farmers were increasingly ignored. In their place, new structures of power emerged urban, elitist, and extractive, gradually breaking the time-honored relationship between the peasant and the palace. What followed was disillusionment, unrest, and ultimately rebellion. Yoruba agrarian society, the heart of the region. The Yoruba people of southwestern Nigeria cultivated more than crops. They nurtured a way of life deeply intertwined with the land. Agriculture was not just a means of survival, it was a cultural institution. From the rich cocoa plantations of Ondo and Ilesa to the yam-rich valleys of Ekiti and Ibadan, farming was done collectively, with respect for seasonal cycles and the spiritual sanctity of the earth. Land was viewed not merely as property, but as heritage, a connection to ancestors and future generations. Agricultural rhythms followed nature's cues, and farmers cooperated in planting, harvesting, and sharing tools and knowledge. This agrarian order was both productive and sustainable, providing food, cultural continuity, and economic self-sufficiency. However, the intrusion of colonial taxation systems and post-colonial economic strategies disrupted this balance. What had once been a harmonious ecosystem turned into a contested economic space where tradition clashed with imposed bureaucratic systems and the land was increasingly commodified for state gain, political exclusion, and tax oppression. Following independence, government policies increasingly reflected the interests of urban elites rather than rural communities. The political structure, although national in appearance, was tilted against the very population that fed the country. Farmers who once held social and moral capital in their communities became marginalized in a system that neither listened to them nor served their interests. Taxation was among the most potent tools of oppression. Originally framed as a necessary contribution to national development, taxes on cash crops like cocoa became predatory. Even staple food crops were taxed, despite being grown for personal sustenance. Farmers, often illiterate and with little political representation, were left at the mercy of revenue agents who operated without oversight or or empathy. While the cities of Ibadan and Lagos flourished with new infrastructure and services, the rural hinterlands suffered chronic neglect. Roads were barely passable, healthcare was rudimentary, and education facilities were scarce. Yet, it was the peasantry that bore the financial burden of the government's nation-building ambitions, cracking the social contract. A quiet but profound rupture began to take place. The unwritten social contract that had once bound rulers and subjects in mutual obligation started to unravel. Where farmers had once trusted traditional and political leaders to safeguard their welfare, they now felt betrayed. The failure to reinvest agricultural profits into the rural economy widened the gap between the state and the people. Basic amenities remained elusive, and government policies were issued without consultation or understanding of local realities. As the ruling class became more distant and dismissive, the rural poor began to question the legitimacy of their leaders, both traditional and elected. The palace, once a symbol of guardianship and order, began to be viewed as complicit in their suffering. The government's unresponsiveness, coupled with exploitative taxation, eroded loyalty and fueled resentment. What emerged was a population ready not just to complain, but to act. The rise of the Agbekoya spirit. In the late 1960s, amidst growing despair, the seeds of organized resistance began to germinate. The Agbekoya movement, literally farmers who reject suffering, emerged from the heart of Yoruba agrarian life. It was a grassroots rebellion, born not from political ideology, but from necessity and shared outrage. Led by figures like Tafa Adeoye, the Agbekoya resistance began as a coordinated protest against oppressive taxation. However, it quickly evolved into a broader critique of the state's structural neglect and inequities. The farmers mobilized in defiance, not with sophisticated weapons, but with conviction, unity, and a deep understanding of the land they had always defended. This uprising was unprecedented in scale and purpose. It was not merely a riot, but a mass assertion of dignity by the peasantry. The Agbekoya movement challenged not only tax policies, but the legitimacy of a government that had failed to uphold its end of the social contract. Rise of the Agbekoya spirit. The movement gained rapid momentum. Organized meetings in rural communities replaced silent despair with collective action. Farmers blockaded roads, confronted tax collectors, and demanded the removal of corrupt officials. In many cases, traditional rulers who had aligned with exploitative state policies were challenged or deposed. The Agbekoya Rebellion became a symbol of the rural population's awakening, a signal that the peasants were no longer willing to accept political invisibility or economic subjugation. It was both a revolt and a renaissance, as forgotten communities rediscovered their voice and strength. Though eventually subdued by state force, the impact of the Agbekoya uprising was lasting. It forced the government to reconsider its rural policies and proved that political power in Nigeria could no longer ignore the countryside. More importantly, it served as a reminder that social contracts, once broken, do not fade. Quietly, they erupt. Chapter 2. Taxation without representation. Colonial era. Tax legacy. The roots of the unjust taxation system that plagued Yoruba farmers in the post-independence era lie deeply embedded in the colonial enterprise. Under British colonial rule, taxation in Nigeria was never designed as a mechanism for public welfare or development. It was a tool for economic extraction. The British administration implemented a taxation system that was rigid, arbitrary, and punitive, disproportionately targeting indigenous populations, particularly those in agrarian communities like Western Nigeria. authorities relied primarily on indirect forms of taxation, poll taxes, land taxes, and levies on local agricultural produce. These taxes were imposed with little consideration for the economic capacity or social realities of the people. Farmers, the backbone of both the local economy and the colonial supply chain, bore the greatest burden. They were required to pay taxes not only in cash, but also through a portion of their already limited harvests, including staple food items such as yams, cassava, and maize. This exploitative arrangement created a one-sided economic relationship. Wealth flowed from the hands of struggling rural farmers to fuel the colonial administration's infrastructure and urban development, which disproportionately benefited British settlers and colonial elites. Little to nothing was reinvested into the rural communities. The harshness of the system was further exacerbated by the colonial government's disregard for traditional governance structures, further alienating the indigenous population and entrenching a sense of injustice and disempowerment. Post-independence exploitation continues. With Nigeria's independence in 1960, there was widespread optimism that the end of colonial rule would usher in a new era of justice, equity, and participatory governance. For the Yoruba farmers and other rural populations, the expectation was that the newly Nigerian-led government would dismantle the exploitative frameworks of colonial administration, including the harsh tax system, and implement reforms that prioritize the welfare of its people. However, these hopes were quickly dashed. Rather than overhaul the colonial economic structures, the post-independence government inherited and preserved many of them, including the unjust taxation mechanisms. The same tax burdens that had drained the resources of Yoruba farmers under the British were now being enforced by their fellow countrymen. Independence brought political change, but not structural transformation. The policies of the new government continued to place a disproportionate financial burden on rural agricultural communities. Farmers in western Nigeria were still heavily taxed, even as they remained largely excluded from the economic growth and development occurring in urban centers like Ibadan, Lagos, and Abeokuta. Investments in infrastructure, education, and healthcare were largely concentrated in cities, leaving rural areas impoverished and underdeveloped. The divide between the urban elite, who now controlled political and economic power, and the rural poor, deepened. Despite their critical role in sustaining Nigeria's agricultural economy, Yoruba farmers were marginalized. They were overtaxed, undersupported, and increasingly disconnected from the promises of a supposedly independent nation. Instead of liberation, independence extended the chains of economic servitude under a new flag, crushed by unjust tax burdens. By the mid-1960s, the weight of excessive and unbalanced taxation had pushed rural farmers to the brink. The Yoruba agricultural communities, particularly those engaged in the cultivation of cocoa, the region's primary cash crop, faced an ever-increasing tax burden that defied both economic logic and basic fairness. Taxes were levied not only on cocoa, but also on essential food crops such as maize, cassava, and yams. These were crops that farmers needed for both subsistence and local trade. Yet government levies consumed a significant portion of the yield. To make matters worse, the taxes were often set arbitrarily and demanded up front, regardless of fluctuations in market prices or actual harvest yields. For example, even when international cocoa prices fell cutting deeply into farmers' incomes, the government's tax demands remained unchanged. This approach created a paradox, where farmers had to either sell their crops at a loss or face fines and legal penalties. Local government authorities, acting without accountability, frequently inflated tax assessments and imposed additional levies without providing any these services in return. As a result, many farmers fell into debt, were forced to sell their land or produce at exploitative prices, and found themselves trapped in an endless cycle of poverty. Beyond the economic strain, the taxation system inflicted psychological and social harm. It robbed farmers of their dignity and their sense of purpose. Those who had worked hard to sustain not only their families, but the national economy, felt used and discarded. The system treated them not as citizens deserving of protection, but as revenue sources to be exploited. Year after year, their cries for relief were met with silence. Government's deaf ear to the people. Despite growing discontent, the government remained largely unresponsive to the plight of the rural population. Political leaders, many of whom were based in urban areas and disconnected from agrarian realities, focused their attention on power consolidation and patronage politics. The voices of rural farmers, the very people who formed the backbone of the nation's economy, were ignored or dismissed. This neglect was not merely bureaucratic indifference, it was a deliberate political choice. The government treated the rural population as a silent majority whose only value was in the taxes they could generate. There was no real engagement with the farmers' concerns, no consultation, and no representation in the policy-making process. Rural grievances about infrastructure, market access, pricing, and fair taxation were sidelined in favor of urban-centric development agendas. For Yoruba farmers, this exclusion was particularly painful. Historically, they had played active roles in local governance and social mobilization. Now, they were alienated from the very system they had helped to sustain. Their taxes built roads they could not use, funded schools their children could not attend, and supported hospitals located in cities they rarely visited. The growing gap between the rural poor and the urban elite was no longer just economic, it was deeply political. This systemic failure to listen would eventually ignite a powerful grassroots movement. The seeds of resistance began to sprout. As frustration turned into organized defiance, the stage was set for one of the most significant peasant-led uprisings in Nigerian history, the Agbekoya Rebellion. It was no longer just about taxes. It was a battle for justice, voice, and recognition in a nation that had silenced them for too long. Chapter 3, Warnings, Ignored, Early Protests, and Civil Disobedience. The Agbekoya Rebellion did not erupt. Suddenly, it was the result of prolonged neglect and deep-seated frustrations among Yoruba farmers, particularly concerning exploitative taxation and worsening economic hardship. These grievances first emerged as quiet forms of protest long before the uprising took shape. In the rural villages where these farmers lived, the initial resistance was subtle but deliberate. Many began refusing to hand over their produce to tax collectors, a symbolic gesture of non-compliance. These actions, while peaceful, represented a profound message of dissent. Tax collectors, under strict government directives, often responded with force, aggravating an already tense atmosphere. Gradually, these silent refusals evolved into more public expressions of discontent. Small demonstrations took place near government offices and in marketplaces, where farmers voiced their frustrations openly. Yet these early protests were dismissed by authorities as minor disturbances, a misjudgment that revealed the government's failure to understand the growing unrest among the peasant population. Despite their increasing frequency, the protests lacked centralized leadership and remained largely spontaneous. Some remained peaceful, calling for fairer taxation and improved conditions, while others were disruptive, seeking to capture public and government attention. What united all these efforts was a common plea to be heard and treated justly. Government crackdowns, often brutal, did not suppress the protests, but instead intensified them. Arrested or injured protesters became symbols of resistance, reinforcing solidarity among the farmers. Rather than subduing dissent, these measures sowed the seeds of a more organized and determined movement. What the leadership failed to realize was that these protests were not isolated or fleeting. They were the outward expression of long-standing grievances that, if ignored, would ignite into full-blown rebellion. Traditional leaders' silence. In traditional Yoruba society, community chiefs and elders were trusted intermediaries between the people and the state. Their role had long included resolving conflicts and advocating for communal welfare. However, by the time the unrest began, their ability to influence government policy had significantly diminished. Colonial rule had weakened their authority through indirect governance systems that made them subordinate to colonial interests. Post-independence leaders continued this trend, sidelining traditional rulers in favor of centralized political structures. When the farmers turned to these leaders for mediation, they found little support. Many traditional authorities were either too closely aligned with government officials or too constrained by fear or political dependency to challenge state policies. Their failure to act decisively was perceived by many farmers as a betrayal. While a few attempted to intervene, their efforts were largely ineffective. The farmers no longer trusted them to act in their best interest, and the government had little regard for their diminished influence. As a result, traditional leaders lost their credibility, and the farmers were left without a voice to represent them, deepening the crisis and pushing the rural populace toward direct action. Rising resistance and rebellion. By the late 1960s, the situation had reached a tipping point. Government inaction, coupled with ineffective mediation from traditional institutions, created fertile ground for radical resistance. The once scattered protests began to coalesce into an organized movement. Emerging local leaders rallied farmers around a shared purpose: to resist exploitation, reject unjust taxation, and demand equitable treatment. The movement, now gaining structure, became known as Agbekoya, the farmers who reject suffering. It symbolized collective resilience and a refusal to endure continued oppression. With clearer goals and leadership, the resistance escalated. Government buildings, tax offices, and homes of complicit officials became targets of direct action. This was no longer about protest, it was rebellion. The state responded with repression, deploying police and military forces to crush the movement. However, these violent tactics only solidified the farmers' resolve. Each crackdown gave rise to new supporters, fueling a cycle of resistance that the government could no longer control. The early stages of the Agbekoya Rebellion were marked by a determined urgency. Farmers had lost faith in dialogue and waited long enough for justice. With their backs against the wall, they took matters into their own hands, vowing not to relent until they were heard. Chapter 4. Igniting the rebellion's secret meetings and planning the transition from peaceful protest to full-scale rebellion by the Agbekoya was not sudden. It was a calculated and deliberate evolution. In the face of mounting oppression and government indifference, the peasant farmers began organizing in secret away from the reach of colonial and post-colonial state surveillance. These clandestine meetings, held in remote villages, forest enclaves, and the homes of trusted allies, became the incubators of resistance. These gatherings laid the groundwork for what would become a formidable movement. Cut off from mainstream political platforms and formal unions, the farmers turned to grassroots mobilization. Word of mouth, trusted intermediaries, and community networks replaced newspapers and radio broadcasts. In this manner, their cause spread quietly but powerfully across Yoruba land. Discussions at these meetings focused on shared grievances and a common realization. The oppression they suffered would not end without unity and action. The idea of fragmented protests gave way to collective strategy. The farmers knew their power lay in solidarity. Thus, the vision of an organized resistance, a unified movement that could confront the state, was born in these secret meetings. One of the most pivotal outcomes of these early gatherings was a simple yet disruptive strategy: refuse taxation, challenge government officials, and organize mass protests that would destabilize the rural economy and force the government to act. They would wield their relevance as the backbone of the agricultural economy as leverage. Despite the risk of discovery, which could lead to arrest or violence, these meetings continued. They were the spark that would eventually ignite a large-scale rebellion. Leaders and their vision. Unlike some historical uprisings driven by a singular figure, the Agbekoya movement was led by a collective of grassroots leaders, respected elders, dynamic youth, and returned veterans united by a shared cause: justice for the peasant class. Among them was Agbekoya, a well-regarded farmer from Oyo, known for his ability to foster unity across village boundaries. His strength lay in diplomacy and coalition building, bringing together fragmented groups into a coherent force. Then there was Agbekoya, a former soldier whose military experience proved invaluable. His organizational skills and tactical thinking introduced a new level of discipline to the rebellion. Under his guidance, the Agbekoya began to coordinate attacks with strategic precision, targeting government infrastructure and key officials without descending into chaos. These leaders, and others like them, had no desire for anarchy. Their goals were clear and rooted in reform. End exploitative taxation, restructure rural governance, and give voice to the peasants in shaping public policy. Their leadership was not self-serving, it was representative. They bore the burden of their community's aspirations and emerged as powerful symbols of possibility and resistance. For the ordinary farmer, these leaders became tangible proof that change was within reach. Tax refusals and mass uprising. With plans in place and leadership firmly rooted, the Agbekoya began to execute their rebellion. The first major act of defiance was tax refusal direct economic resistance. The farmers, long exploited by a tax system that demanded without giving, collectively withheld payments and produce. This defiance hit the government where it hurt most, its coffers. The colonial and state apparatus relied heavily on rural taxation to fund administration. The refusal to pay posed both an economic threat and a symbolic rejection of legitimacy. Government response was swift and brutal. Tax collectors began seizing property and produce by force. In return, the farmers resisted. They formed human barricades and, when necessary, fought back. Violence escalated as both sides dug in. Soon, targeted attacks on government officials followed. These were not random acts of violence, but calculated responses to sustained oppression. Government buildings were vandalized or destroyed. Tax offices were set ablaze. These acts, shocking in their boldness, signaled the rise of an organized militant resistance. Next came the mass protests. Farmers, once scattered and silent, now marched through towns in thousands, chanting, carrying placards, and demanding reform. These demonstrations, though largely peaceful at first, turned violent when state forces intervened. The sight of barefoot peasants confronting police batons and bullets drew national attention and sympathy. The government, alarmed by the growing unrest, troops to restore order. But it was too late. The Agbekoya had become more than a protest. They were now a movement. Their rebellion had crossed the point of no return, becoming one of the most significant peasant uprisings in Nigeria's history. The battle lines had been drawn. What started as whispered complaints in forest huts had exploded into a regional insurrection that challenged the very structure of governance in western Nigeria. Summary of Volume 1, The Gathering Storm. The Road to Rebellion. Volume 1 of Agbekoya. The rebellion against oppression offers a vivid, layered exploration of the conditions that led to one of Nigeria's most formidable grassroots uprisings. Spanning 4 chapters, this volume chronicles the gradual unraveling of a fragile social contract between the Yoruba peasantry and a governing elite increasingly detached from the plight of the rural masses. Chapter 1, The Peasants and the Palace, introduces the agrarian heartland of western Nigeria, a region where hard-working farmers formed the backbone of the economy, yet remained marginalized in political and economic decisions. It outlines how colonial and post-colonial policies, particularly excessive taxation and exploitative governance, bred discontent among a people long neglected by those in power. Chapter 2, Seeds of Resistance, delves into the escalating tension as the farmers' grievances go unheard. Attempts at lawful protest and appeals to traditional authorities prove futile, exposing the deepening gap between the rulers and the ruled. The rural poor begin to recognize their collective strength and the necessity of unified action in confronting the systems that oppress them. Chapter 3, A People Pushed to the Brink, portrays the psychological and economic breaking point. Here, the narrative shifts from simmering frustration to outright determination. The government's heavy-handed response to isolated acts of defiance only fuels the movement, as farmers, united by hardship, start to see rebellion not just as an option, but as a duty. Chapter 4, The Rebellion Ignites, captures the pivotal moment when quiet resistance transforms into organized revolt. In remote locations, and under the cover of night, secret gatherings evolve into strategic war rooms. Leaders such as Olatunji Adebayo and Ganu Ayatunde emerge, grounding the movement in unity, discipline, and purpose. With tax refusals, attacks on officials, and mass protests sweeping across towns and villages, the Agbekoya movement shakes the pillars of the political establishment. What began as isolated discontent becomes a coordinated uprising, one that would soon alter the political terrain of western Nigeria. Altogether, Volume 1 presents a compelling narrative of courage, organization, and the power of collective action. It lays the foundation for understanding how ordinary citizens armed with resolve and unity can challenge systemic injustice and demand transformative change. Volume 2, The War of the Oppressed, Battles and Resistance and Female Power. Introduction, The War of the Oppressed. Battles and Resistance and Female Power plunges us into the searing core of the Agbekoya Rebellion, a movement that evolved from scattered murmurs of discontent into an all-out war for survival, justice, and dignity. This volume explores the explosive phase of the uprising, where resistance hardened into rebellion and silence gave way to thunderous defiance. What began as a reaction to economic exploitation and systemic neglect quickly transformed into a coordinated revolt that spread like wildfire across western Nigeria's Yoruba heartland. The Agbekoya, a movement whose name symbolized the people's collective refusal to suffer and smile, now shifted from passive civil disobedience to strategic and audacious warfare. Using guerrilla tactics, the farmers targeted the pillars of colonial and post-independence governance tax offices, administrative agents, and outbursts of vengeance, but calculated strikes designed to disrupt and dismantle the oppressive structures that had governed rural life for decades. They used their deep knowledge of the land of forests, farmlands, and narrow village paths as tactical advantage, turning their environment into a weapon of resistance. Female power and hidden pillars of the movement. Amidst the clamor of war and resistance, Volume 2 also lifts the veil on a rarely acknowledged but critical dimension of the rebellion, the pivotal role of women. Often overlooked in historical accounts, rural women served as silent sentinels, intelligence networks, couriers, and spiritual anchors for the rebellion. While many men engaged directly in raids and confrontations, it was women who preserved food supplies, hid fugitives, offered traditional medicine, and spread coded messages. Some, emboldened by the urgency of the times, even joined in the physical struggle. The female power behind Agbekoya was not only logistical, but ideological, embodying the moral backbone of the movement, and reminding the nation that the fight was not just about taxes, but about dignity, family, land, and legacy. Their contributions made the rebellion not just a farmer's war, but a community's war, and redefined the rebellion as one involving the whole of Yoruba society. A nation confronts its crisis. As the rebellion intensified, the Nigerian government responded with force, deploying military troops and implementing harsh crackdowns. The stakes rose sharply, and what had begun as a regional protest soon became a national crisis, forcing the state to confront the possibility of systemic collapse. Towns erupted. Rural silence was broken. The struggle spread from thatched homes and cocoa farms to streets, city centers, and government houses. The Agbekoya Rebellion. Now a war was no longer just about taxes. It became a confrontation between a forgotten people and a ruling class clinging to power. It revealed the depth of alienation, the force of collective resistance, and the peril of ignoring the pulse of the grassroots. More importantly, it birthed a political awakening both for the nation and for the ordinary citizen. In Volume 2, we witness the rebellion at its most intense, desperate, and transformative moment. The Agbekoya movement becomes not just a protest or a revolt, it becomes a battle for the soul of a people, with men and women standing side by side to challenge a legacy of oppression and redefine the future of their homeland. Chapter 1. The uprising spreads escalation across western Nigeria. The Agbekoya Rebellion, which had initially been a scattered uprising against oppressive tax systems and poor governance, was rapidly evolving into a full-scale revolt. It was a revolt against a system that had long disregarded the concerns of the farming population, those who were the backbone of the economy, but had been continually overlooked in political discourse. By now, the rebellion had begun to spread beyond its origins in the villages of western Nigeria, engulfing the entire region with its flames of resistance. What started as isolated protests, primarily in rural areas, had quickly become a full-fledged battle for justice that challenged the very fabric of the Nigerian state. Word of the rebellion spread quickly across the region. News of victories against government officials, attacks on tax collectors, and defiant marches from the countryside reached the urban centers of western Nigeria. People from all walks of life began to see the Agbekoya as a symbol of resistance, and their message found an echo in the hearts of workers, traders, and students. In cities like Ibadan, Lagos, and Agbekoya, there was a growing sense of solidarity with the farmers' struggle. Local leaders, who had previously been silent in the face of injustice, began to speak out in support of the rebellion. Though many still feared the repercussions of openly aligning themselves with the farmers, the sentiment in the cities was was shifting. In several cases, urban workers organized protests, showing solidarity with their rural counterparts. The rebellion's spread was also aided by the inefficiency and corruption within the government itself. The Nigerian leadership, still grappling with the challenges of post-independence governance, was increasingly seen as weak and unable to handle the rising tide of discontent. As each day passed, more individuals joined the cause, whether out of solidarity, fear of reprisals, or a genuine desire to see the oppressive system overthrown. Attacks on tax collectors and government agents. In the early stages, acts of defiance against the authorities were spontaneous. Individual farmers or small groups of peasants might refuse to pay taxes or voice their anger in small-scale protests. But as the rebellion spread, it became clear that the farmers were no longer fighting with mere complaints. They had united under a shared cause that could no longer be ignored. One of the first major shifts in the rebellion's escalation was the systematic targeting of government officials and tax collectors. For years, these individuals had been the face of the oppressive system sent by colonial and post-independence governments to extract money from farmers through coercive means. Tax collectors, armed with the government's power, had been an ever-present threat to the peasants' survival. The Agbekoya understood this. The battle was not only about the burden of taxation, but about dismantling the machinery that enforced it. With a deep sense of injustice simmering in their hearts, the farmers launched organized attacks on these representatives of the government. At first, these attacks were swift and stealthy, designed to undermine the legitimacy of the authorities. The farmers' guerrilla-style tactics, striking suddenly and then vanishing into the forests, made the task of fighting back difficult for the government forces. What began as isolated incidents quickly spread to larger attacks across the region. Whole groups of peasants would descend upon government buildings, tax collectors' homes, or administrative offices, throwing the state into chaos. In one of the earliest coordinated strikes, a group of farmers ambushed a convoy carrying tax collectors in Ibadan. The attackers, numbering in the dozens, managed to overrun the convoy, leaving several of the tax officials injured or killed. This marked a turning point in the rebellion. No longer could it be written off as a disorganized outbreak of violence. It was now clear that the farmers were not simply reacting to oppression. They were organizing and preparing for a much larger confrontation. Community organization and traditional influence. The Agbekoya were not a military force. They were farmers, peasants, and rural workers. However, they were determined, and they knew how to use their environment to their advantage. It was this knowledge of the land, its waterways, and its secret paths that gave them an edge over the Nigerian military. The government's forces, equipped with modern weapons, struggled to deal with an enemy that knew the land intimately, moving with precision and disappearing just as quickly as they struck. Guerrilla warfare became the perfect strategy for a group that had no access to tanks, planes, or heavy artillery. Using their deep understanding of the rural terrain, the Agbekoya launched attacks on government forces from hidden positions in the forest, along riversides, and from remote villages. The farmers carried out swift raids, focusing on key government targets such as tax offices, military posts, and supply routes. In one of the most dramatic acts of defiance, a group of farmers ambushed a military convoy carrying supplies to a local government station. They used the dense forest and thick undergrowth to set up a series of traps and barricades along the convoy's route. The soldiers had no time to respond and were quickly overpowered, with the farmers seizing crucial supplies. This success boosted the morale of the Agbekoya movement and sent a clear message to the government. The The farmers were not powerless. They had the ability to disrupt the state's authority at will. While the farmers had united under the banner of resistance, the role of traditional leadership in the rebellion was complex. The elders, chiefs, and local rulers who had once mediated between the people and the government were now caught between conflicting interests. Some traditional leaders were aligned with the government to preserve their power, while others, who had farming backgrounds or close ties to the community, sympathized with the rebels. This duality led to a fractured response. Some chiefs condemned the rebellion. Others provided covert support, shelter, or simply turned a blind eye. In certain regions, traditional leaders even protected rebels from government forces, understanding that the rebellion was a reaction to long-standing injustices. Chapter 2. The State Strikes Back, Military Deployment and Brutality. As the Agbekoya Rebellion spread across the heart of western Nigeria, the government could no longer dismiss the movement as a minor rural disturbance. What began as a grassroots resistance against colonial-era tax structures had quickly escalated into a formidable insurgency that threatened the very foundations of regional governance. Faced with this challenge, the Western Nigerian government responded with force swift, decisive, and uncompromisingly brutal. Initially underestimating the rebellion's scale, the government deployed only a limited number of police officers. However, as the farmers' defiance grew in coordination and confidence, a much larger and more forceful military response was ordered. Soldiers, paramilitary units, and a reinforced police presence flooded the region, equipped with armored vehicles, heavy artillery, and air support. Strategic locations, bridges, market centers, and rural roads were occupied. In cities like Ibadan, Oyo, and Osogbo, military checkpoints and surveillance units became common, with intelligence operations targeting both actual and suspected rebel sympathizers. Towns and villages believed to harbor Agbekoya members were subjected to martial law. Local leaders accused of collaborating with the rebels were arrested without due process. The sweeping powers granted to the military allowed for mass detentions, searches, and interrogations, further alienating the already aggrieved peasant population. Yet despite the overwhelming show of force, the government's campaign was met with persistent resistance. The rural familiarity and agility of the Agbekoya fighters enabled them to blend in with the civilian population, evading capture and undermining the state's control. The government's heavy-handed tactics, rather than restoring order, deepened the rift between the rulers and the ruled, fueling, rather than extinguishing the flames of rebellion. Arrests, executions, and surveillance. The escalation of the rebellion was met with increasingly repressive measures. Determined to crush the uprising, the government resorted to tactics that shocked even the most hardened observers. Entire communities came under suspicion. In mass raids, soldiers rounded up anyone thought to be associated with the Agbekoya, including family members of suspected fighters, sympathizers, and those who merely voiced dissent. Detainees were transported to undisclosed detention camps known for their inhumane conditions. Reports surfaced of torture, starvation, and forced labor. Legal due process was abandoned in favor of military tribunals, where swift and often arbitrary judgments were passed. Public executions became an instrument of state terror. Captured rebels and sometimes civilians were paraded before townsfolk and executed without fair trials. In many cases, their bodies were left on display in town squares and marketplaces, a grim warning to others. Rather than cowing the population into submission, these spectacles of violence stirred outrage and hardened resolve. Families who lost loved ones in the crackdown pledged vengeance, and previously neutral individuals joined the rebellion. protest against tax injustice had become a broader war for dignity and survival against an oppressive state apparatus. Agbekoya guerrilla resistance. The government's military superiority in manpower and firepower was countered by the agility, resilience, and local knowledge of the Agbekoya fighters. Recognizing that conventional warfare would be futile, the rebels adopted guerrilla tactics, hit-and-run operations, surprise ambushes, and sabotage missions that exploited their deep understanding of the terrain. Armed with machetes, bows, arrows, and improvised firearms, the Agbekoya executed precise and often devastating attacks. One of the most renowned operations was an ambush of a military convoy in the forests of Oyo State. Executed by a small band of trained rebels, the assault resulted in significant government casualties and the capture of arms and supplies, both a symbolic and strategic victory that sent shockwaves across the region. To maintain the momentum, the Agbekoya employed shifting battlefronts. They avoided staying in one area too long, keeping government forces on the move and off balance. These tactics frustrated the military and forced it into a reactive stance, spreading its resources thin. The rebellion evolved to include attacks on infrastructure communication lines, transportation hubs, and supply depots, further hampering the government's ability to enforce control. Surveillance efforts intensified, but the Agbekoya's integration into the rural populace and their network of informants rendered these measures ineffective. Ultimately, the brutality of the government's crackdown only reinforced the legitimacy of the rebellion in the eyes of the masses. The Agbekoya movement had transformed from a tax revolt into a powerful symbol of resistance to oppression. The battle lines had been drawn, not just between rebels and government, but between the marginalized and the machinery of state power. Chapter 3: The Secret War. The women behind the lines. In every revolution, there are unsung heroes figures whose sacrifices and contributions are veiled by the dominant narratives of conflict. The Agbekoya Rebellion was no different. Though the historical spotlight has often rested on the male warriors who clashed openly with government forces, a parallel war was being waged in kitchens, markets, forest trails, and prayer rooms, one led by women. These women, living under the same economic strain and political oppression as their male counterparts, were neither idle observers nor passive victims. They were courageous actors in the unfolding drama of resistance, asserting their agency in a society that often confined them to domestic roles. Their resistance was not only against unjust taxation, but also against patriarchal norms that underestimated their power and relevance. In the towns and villages of western Nigeria, women held secret meetings, raised funds, and whispered messages of rebellion across compound walls and market stalls. They bore the burden of maintaining homes while their sons and husbands fought, yet they themselves became pillars of the rebellion's survival and moral force. Their dual resistance against both colonial-style governance and societal gender bias made their contribution even more remarkable. Intelligence, logistics, and spiritual fortitude. Among the most strategic roles women played was that of intelligence gathering. The Agbekoya movement, while fierce and spontaneous, required foreknowledge of government movements, surprise raids, and troop deployments to maintain an edge. Women, through informal but highly effective networks, became the movement's eyes and ears. As traders, farmers, or housemaids, they moved easily across spaces inaccessible to male rebels' marketplaces, town halls, and even the homes of government officials. They listened quietly to conversations, picked up rumors, and observed unusual military activity. Then, under the veil of night, or through subtle coded language, they relayed this information to rebel leaders. In some cases, women infiltrated government offices under the guise of routine domestic visits, memorizing troop locations, or even copying documents. These intelligence feats were not acts of convenience, they were acts of courage. For a woman caught in such an act, punishment would have been swift and brutal, yet they persisted. Just as important was the role of women in logistics. As the rebellion intensified, the government's strategy involved cutting off food and supply chains to starve out the movement. But women circumvented these blockades. They smuggled food in baskets of vegetables, hid medical supplies in clothing bundles, and crafted rudimentary weapons from farming tools. Their knowledge of terrain and local routes gave them an edge, and they became the unofficial supply chain of the rebellion. Beyond the tangible, they also sustained the fighters emotionally and spiritually. When morale waned, it was women who offered encouragement, sometimes through direct messages, other times through communal prayers and songs of hope. They kept the hearth warm for fighters returning from the forest and helped raise the children of those who did not return. They were, quite literally, the backbone of the community during the storm. A few women even crossed into combat when their families or villages were directly threatened. Though untrained in warfare, they fought with the fury of mothers defending their children. In doing so, they broke social conventions and emerged as local heroine symbols of the rebellion's inclusiveness and its depth of resolve, a legacy, unwritten but undeniable today. The legacy of these women remains largely absent from the pages of history, overshadowed by more visible figures and battlefield exploits. Yet without their involvement, strategic, logistical, and spiritual, the rebellion may well have crumbled under the weight of superior military force. Their defiance, disguised in daily routines and whispered prayers, made them the quiet architects of the movement's resilience. The story of the Agbekoya Rebellion is incomplete without the story of these women. In telling it, we not only honor their courage, but also recognize a broader truth, that in every struggle for justice, those behind the lines often bear the heaviest load and shape the deepest change. Chapter 4. The Ultimate Betrayal, Government Espionage and Informants. The Agbekoya Rebellion, which had initially surged as a grassroots movement against oppressive taxation and systemic injustice, encountered not only physical resistance from the state, but also psychological warfare waged in the shadows. As the ranks of the Agbekoya swelled with determined farmers, the government recognized that brute force alone would not suffice. The rebellion had become more than a protest, it was a growing tide threatening the colonial and post-colonial order. In response, the government implemented a sophisticated and deeply unsettling countermeasure: infiltration and espionage. Secret agents and informants became the invisible hand, weakening the rebellion from within. Many of these operatives were embedded in the very communities that had given birth to the resistance. These individuals were not always strangers. Some were familiar faces, trusted neighbors, relatives, or community members covertly recruited to serve the government's interests. Some posed as fellow rebels, marching, strategizing, and fighting side by side with the movement. Others took less visible but equally damaging roles, gathering intelligence on camp locations, leadership plans, and supply routes. The deception was chilling in its effectiveness. Rebels found themselves led into ambushes after plans had been subtly leaked. Supplies disappeared. Weapons caches were discovered. Leadership meetings were interrupted by sudden raids. False intelligence became a weapon just as potent as any firearm. The government's informants sowed confusion, paranoia, and suspicion among the rebel leadership. Mistrust crept into the movement like a virus, infecting even the strongest of bonds. As this atmosphere of uncertainty deepened, the cohesive strength of the Agbekoya began to fracture. Meetings were no longer marked by unity, but by tension and side glances. The resistance, once characterized by a brotherhood of purpose, began to unravel from the inside. A woman within, love, loyalty, and betrayal. Among the many covert operations launched by the government, one act of betrayal would come to symbolize the psychological and emotional warfare of the era. This was the infiltration, orchestrated by a female intelligence operative, an enigmatic figure whose very presence within the rebellion's heart would bring about one of its deepest wounds. This woman, whose real name was obscured by the passage of time and by the shame that surrounded her actions, had been a familiar and trusted face in one of the villages central to the Agbekoya movement. She was perceived as a supporter of the cause, a symbol of rural resilience and the collective pain of the oppressed. Yet, behind her quiet demeanor was a secret allegiance. Whether driven by personal disillusionment, political conviction, or promises made by the state security for her family, financial reward, or even coercion, she accepted the government's assignment. Her task was both simple and complex: marry a key rebel leader and use the intimate access it granted to gather intelligence, influence decisions, and disrupt the rebellion from its core. Her proximity to power gave her unique access. Pillow talk turned into strategic leakage. Her influence over her husband's thinking proved invaluable to the government. She began to subtly sway his judgment, casting doubt on certain attacks, encouraging caution where courage was needed, and planting seeds of fear about betrayal by fellow leaders. She manipulated not only information, but also emotions. In some cases, she altered communiques, diverted messages, and convinced her husband to retreat from promising strategies. At times, her role extended beyond passive observation. She became an active saboteur, fueling mistrust and leading her husband into decisions that resulted in deadly government ambushes. This act of betrayal stung more deeply than many others because it came clothed in intimacy. It was a wound dealt not by a soldier's weapon, but by a lover's whisper. Her betrayal was not merely tactical, it was emotional and symbolic. It represented how deeply the state was willing to invade personal lives to maintain control. And it demonstrated that even love, under pressure, could become a tool of war. Internal collapse and aftermath. With the rebellion's secrets exposed and its leaders compromised, the government launched a series of calculated offensives, targeting the movement's lifeblood, its trust, coordination, and morale. Having identified key rebel encampments and stockpiles through insider knowledge, government forces mounted swift and deadly assaults. Surprise attacks decimated rebel leadership cells. Supply routes were cut off. Reinforcements were ambushed. And within weeks, a rebellion that had once seemed unstoppable found itself in retreat. Psychological warfare played a decisive role. Fake broadcasts were issued, falsely declaring the surrender of key leaders. Propaganda leaflets were dropped from aircrafts, claiming betrayals that hadn't occurred, thereby making them real as paranoia tightened its grip. Government agents spread rumors of mass defections, internal coups, and imminent betrayals, further isolating rebel factions. Perhaps the final blow was orchestrated through the female informant. Trusted as a member of the inner circle, she allegedly persuaded her husband and a faction of leaders to abandon a crucial stronghold, leaving behind a strategic location the government seized within hours. That retreat marked the symbolic fall of the rebellion's backbone. As unity crumbled, so did the rebels' resolve. The Agbekoya were not only of solidarity became an echo of suspicion. The aftermath was marked by silence and shame. Survivors disappeared into the bush or returned to their villages in defeat. Some were captured, others were executed. But for many, the deeper wound was the knowledge that their rebellion had not died in battle. It had been slowly poisoned from within. The legacy of the betrayal. The story of the Agbekoya Rebellion is one of courage, resistance, and ultimately betrayal. The use of espionage by the government, especially the psychological damage inflicted through the woman operative, demonstrated how modern conflict is not only fought on battlefields, but in minds, hearts, and homes. The betrayal shifted the narrative of the rebellion. It became not just a political uprising, but a cautionary tale of infiltration, trust, and the cost of divided loyalty. While the rebellion faltered under the weight of sabotage, its legacy endures as a lesson in the vulnerabilities of grassroots movements. The woman at the center of the betrayal remains a haunting figure. Was she a villain or a victim, a traitor or a tragic figure caught between survival and conviction? History offers no clear answers, only the echo of her choices and the irreversible consequences they brought. In the end, the Agbekoya were not only defeated by military force, but by their inability to withstand betrayal. And that perhaps is the ultimate tragedy of their story, the loss not just of a battle, but of belief in one another. Volume 3, Wisdom and Diplomacy. Negotiating Peace, Losing Ground. Introduction. The Agbekoya Rebellion, though marked by fierce resistance, violence, and grassroots resilience, eventually transitioned from the brutality of armed conflict to the delicate terrain of negotiation and diplomacy. In Volume 3, Wisdom and Diplomacy, Negotiating Peace, Losing Ground, we examine the twilight of the rebellion, a time when battle cries softened into whispered conversations, and the scorched earth of villages gave way to round tables of fragile dialogue. By the time the government reached its breaking point, it had become apparent that brute force alone could not crush the spirit or the will of the Agbekoya movement. The rebels, battered but unyielding, had demonstrated an unexpected level of organization, courage, and endurance. The state's continued reliance on military might had not only failed to extinguish the uprising, but had also exposed the limits of coercion in the face of mass resistance. The toll in lives lost, communities shattered, and the erosion of legitimacy became too costly to ignore. At the same time, within the Agbekoya ranks, exhaustion had set in. Disillusioned by internal betrayals and the heavy cost borne by their families and farmlands, many among the leadership began to reflect on the sustainability of endless conflict. The fighters had earned their place in history, but the question remained: could victory also be claimed through wisdom, patience, and political transformation? Amid this shift in tone, a new force emerged at the center of the peace process: the traditional rulers, respected elders, and community mediators who had long served as custodians of moral authority. These figures, deeply rooted in both the grassroots and elite circles, held the trust of the people and the ears of the powerful. Their credibility made them indispensable intermediaries between the rebels and the state. It was through these elders that the first secret overtures were made. Hidden from public view, in compounds and neutral spaces, negotiations began slow, cautious, and deeply fraught. The conversations were not always hopeful. Mistrust ran deep. Yet they persisted. What had begun as a grassroots rebellion driven by economic injustice and political alienation now stood at the edge of a fragile peace, shaped by compromise and the wisdom of those who understood that lasting change required more than victory transition from violence to dialogue was neither smooth nor absolute. The negotiated truce that eventually emerged did not resolve all grievances. It offered no sweeping reforms or heroic declarations. Instead, it offered something quieter, but perhaps more enduring, a chance to regroup, to enter the political and social spaces of influence, and to fight for justice through new channels. For many Agbekoya veterans, laying down arms did not mean surrender, it meant evolving the struggle. In this volume, we delve into the complexity of that evolution. We explore the leadership's awakening to the necessity of dialogue, the strategic roles played by traditional mediators, and the tensions that shadowed every step of the peace process. The battle may have ended, but the journey for dignity and justice was far from over. The war for the oppressed gave way to the politics of survival, and in that transition, the Agbekoya movement would find new meaning, new strategies, and new enemies. What was gained in diplomacy came with loss of momentum, unity, and revolutionary zeal. Yet within that loss lay the seeds of transformation. Wisdom and diplomacy, once dismissed as weakness, became the new tools of resistance. Chapter 1. Leadership Awakens, Dialogue, and Hesitant Negotiations. At the height of the Agbekoya Rebellion, the idea of negotiation seemed both distant and impractical. The region was engulfed in tension, and emotions ran high as both the state and the Agbekoya stood at opposing ends, each rooted deeply in its convictions. The government, clinging to its instruments of control, responded with military force, arresting community leaders and deploying troops into the farmlands. On the other hand, the farmers, weary of years of economic hardship and systemic injustice, rallied around their cause with unwavering resolve. Initially, no one believed that dialogue was even possible. What dialogue could exist between a government seen as oppressive and farmers regarded as mere insurgents? Yet as time passed and the rebellion spread like wildfire across the western region, reality set in. The government's harsh methods, raids, imprisonment, executions, were not extinguishing the resistance. If anything, they were strengthening it. The farmers, familiar with the terrain and driven by desperation, employed guerrilla tactics that kept government forces in disarray. Eventually, it became evident that the use of force alone would lead to a protracted and costly conflict. Not only would it bleed the government's resources dry, but it would also erode the already fragile social contract. The western region was on the brink, and behind closed doors, some within the government began to admit that there had to be another way. It was not a sudden shift, but a slow and painful realization. Military strategies continued, but they were now accompanied by muted conversations, whispers of potential dialogue, of mediation, of finding a path that would bring stability without further bloodshed. Among the ranks of the political class, progressive voices emerged, advocating for negotiation as a strategic necessity rather than a sign of weakness. Still, hesitation lingered. The hardliners within the government insisted that yielding to the farmers' demands would embolden other marginalized groups. Meanwhile, the Agbekoya leadership was also divided. Though united by purpose, they were fragmented in approach. Some factions viewed negotiations as an opportunity to secure real reform, while others saw it as a trap, a ruse by the government to dissolve their movement from within. Despite the resistance on both sides, efforts toward dialogue gradually gained traction. Secret meetings were arranged, far from the public eye. These meetings were characterized by silence and suspicion, but also by a shared weariness of war. These early talks were tentative, cautious, and frequently interrupted by renewed clashes on the ground. trust was spun, the role of mediators and elders. As the conversations continued, one crucial element began to shape the process: the involvement of traditional rulers, local elders, and respected community mediators. These individuals, grounded in the culture and history of the Yoruba people, held a unique place in society. Unlike the politicians or soldiers, they spoke the language of the people, both literally and symbolically. These traditional leaders had witnessed firsthand the toll the rebellion had taken. They were respected by the farmers, many of whom were their kinsmen, and still held influence within the corridors of regional power. Their moral authority, coupled with a genuine desire to restore peace, made them invaluable to the peace process. But even for these mediators, the task was far from easy. The farmers had become wary of anything linked to the government, and even the traditional rulers were not spared their skepticism. Some mediators had to rebuild their credibility from the ground up, engaging the farmers with humility, honesty, and a willingness to listen without judgment. They navigated between anger and hope, fear and trust, carrying messages across lines drawn by years of injustice and resistance. The elders framed peace not as submission, but as a strategic choice. They appealed to the dignity of the farmers, recognizing their grievances while urging them to think of the future of their children, their lands, their legacies. Simultaneously, they urged the government to demonstrate goodwill through immediate actions, release of detained farmers, reduction of oppressive levies, and recognition of local farmer unions. Bit by bit, these efforts bore fruit. Traditional rulers helped to set the tone of the secret negotiations, ensuring that they were not reduced to mere political theatre. Their influence helped to stabilize emotions in the room and bring focus to the discussions. While the government offered tentative concessions, like lifting some of the harsh taxes and restoring seized land, the Agbekoya fighters offered a partial ceasefire, holding back attacks while talks continued. Still, the journey to peace was fragile and uncertain. Every delay or misstep in implementing agreements risked renewed fighting. The farmers wanted more than promises, they demanded action. The government, fearing the precedent it might set, remained cautious. What emerged in the end was not a perfect agreement, but a critical pause in a destructive spiral. The peace, mediated by Yoruba elders and cautious diplomats, allowed both sides to regroup, reflect, and consider the larger implications of their actions. In this chapter, we witness the stirring of leadership, not just among the politicians and rebel commanders, but among the community elders, the cultural gatekeepers, and the ordinary people who bore the scars of war and the hopes of peace. Leadership awakened not only in strength, but in the courage to negotiate, to listen, and to imagine a better future. This fragile truce would not be the end of the Agbekoya movement. The deep issues, land rights, fair taxation, equitable governance, remained unresolved. But for the first time, dialogue had emerged as a tool of resistance, and leadership had expanded beyond the battlefield into the heart of the people's aspirations. Chapter 2. Rebels opt for peace, strategic ceasefire. The Agbekoya Rebellion, which had for years been a battle of survival, defiance, and revolution, now faced its most difficult test: whether to continue a bitter and costly fight, or to pursue a peace that was both fragile and uncertain. As clandestine peace talks progressed behind closed doors, the leaders of the Agbekoya movement stood at a critical crossroads. Their decision would determine not only the fate of the rebellion, but also the future of their communities. It was no longer merely a choice between war and peace. It was a decision between the chaos of continued bloodshed and the elusive promise of meaningful change through dialogue. The stakes were enormous and the consequences profound. These leaders, who had risen through their ability to channel the anger and frustration of the oppressed, now found themselves engaging in a different kind of battle, a diplomatic one. The constant skirmishes, economic strain, and mounting casualties had worn down even the most hardened fighters. The farmers and their families had paid dearly, and the emotional weight of these losses pressed heavily on their leaders. Choosing to pursue peace did not mean abandoning the cause. Rather, it reflected a profound shift in strategy, a realization that sustainable progress might only be possible through compromise. But this strategic ceasefire required the leaders to relinquish their most potent weapon, armed resistance. It meant trusting in negotiations with a government that had long been the face of oppression, and hoping that dialogue could succeed where confrontation had failed. Difficult decisions the Agbekoya leadership, forged in the crucible of revolt, now had to tread the delicate path of negotiation. Many of their followers remained deeply skeptical, worried that peace would equate to surrender and the erosion of hard-fought gains. Yet, the leaders felt a growing moral and strategic responsibility to consider the long-term welfare of their people. At the negotiation table, the Agbekoya representatives were joined by traditional rulers acting as mediators, attempting to bridge the deep chasm of distrust between the rebels and the state. These royal intermediaries appealed to history, kinship, and a shared future to guide the talks away from bloodshed and towards dialogue. Still, diplomacy was unfamiliar terrain. Accustomed to mobilizing resistance, the Agbekoya leaders had to quickly adapt their tone, approach, and expectations. The government was unwilling to grant sweeping reforms such as full autonomy for farmers or the redistribution of land. Instead, they offered a package of concessions, a significant reduction in oppressive taxes, the promise of fairer economic opportunities, and the release of imprisoned rebel leaders. Though far from the revolutionary transformation envisioned at the movement's inception, these terms presented the first real opportunity for structural relief. Accepting them would not satisfy all factions within the movement. Some fighters viewed the shift as capitulation, others as a strategic pivot. The leadership, after intense deliberation, chose the path of negotiation not out of weakness, but out of foresight. They understood that while ideals fuel a rebellion, pragmatism sustains a movement. Peace, however incomplete, could protect the lives and livelihoods of countless farmers who had borne the brunt of the struggle. Gains and setbacks in the truce. The peace agreement that followed was both a milestone and a mixed blessing. On one hand, the farmers secured crucial victories. Chief among them was the reduction of the punitive taxes that had sparked the rebellion in the first place. For many rural communities, this alone was a transformative relief. The tax burden had crippled agricultural productivity and deepened poverty. Its easing represented a vital reprieve. Moreover, the government's decision to release several imprisoned Agbekoya leaders was not just a goodwill gesture, it was a recognition of the political legitimacy of the movement. This act elevated the status of the Agbekoya struggle from insurgency to legitimate political resistance, and it offered a psychological boost to farmers who had risked everything in the rebellion. However, the truce came with significant compromises. There would be no redistribution of land, no systemic overhaul. The deeper roots of exploitation, corruption, and marginalization remained intact. Many within the Agbekoya ranks felt that the fundamental causes of their suffering had been merely acknowledged, not addressed. For them, the gains felt symbolic rather than transformative. Furthermore, the once revered rebel leaders now had to contend with a new challenge, loss of revolutionary stature. In choosing peace, they had accepted political reality, but in doing so, risked being viewed by some as sellouts or compromisers. The mythos of the fearless warrior was slowly giving way to that of the reluctant negotiator. Yet despite these setbacks, the peace marked a new beginning. The Agbekoya farmers, though bruised and constrained, had not been defeated. They had demonstrated that organized grassroots resistance could disrupt power structures and force even the most rigid of regimes to the negotiating table. The rebellion had ended, but the fight for justice had not. The farmers now transitioned from warriors to watchdogs, vigilant, persistent, and deeply aware that peace without equity would only be temporary. The struggle had evolved from a rebellion for revolution to a campaign for reform, negotiation, and continuous pressure. Chapter 3: A Fragile Truce. The truce that brought an end to the Agbekoya Rebellion was in many ways a turning point in Western Nigeria's political and agrarian history. It marked the cessation of open hostilities between the state and the disgruntled farmers who had risen in defiance of systemic oppression. Yet, as the dust settled and the echoes of resistance faded, a deeper truth began to emerge. While the peace agreement temporarily soothed the unrest, it did little to address the entrenched structural problems that had given birth to the uprising in the first place. Though the truce was celebrated by the government and presented as a diplomatic success, it was at its core a fragile compromise. The reforms introduced were largely reactionary and palliative, intended to calm tensions rather than transform the socio-economic realities of the rural population. What resulted was a temporary patch over a deeply frayed fabric. This chapter explores the nature of those reforms, the lingering economic challenges that persisted in their wake, and the remarkable resilience of the Agbekoya farmers, whose struggle for dignity and justice continued long after the guns fell silent. Temporary reforms. One of the most prominent features of the peace agreement was the introduction of short-term reforms designed to appease the Agbekoya movement and restore public order. Chief among these was the reduction of the oppressive taxation system that had become a symbol of government overreach and rural exploitation. The heavy taxes levied on farmers had long been a source of tension, dating back to colonial policies, and continued with even greater ruthlessness in the post-independence period. The promise of tax relief, therefore, represented a concrete concession to the farmers' most immediate demand. For many, it was a welcome reprieve from years of punitive levies that had drained their resources and tested their will. In addition to tax reform, the government pledged to enhance rural infrastructure by improving roads, schools, and healthcare facilities in agrarian communities. These promises were touted as signs of the administration's renewed commitment to the welfare of its citizens. In a few cases, the reforms were quickly initiated, and some rural areas experienced tangible improvements. The immediate impact was a noticeable decrease in public demonstrations and violent resistance. For the Agbekoya farmers, weary from struggle, this initial wave of change offered a glimmer of hope. However, these concessions, while important, failed to address the deeper structural imbalances that had provoked the rebellion. The reforms were narrowly focused, reactive rather than visionary. They offered relief without redress, placating grievances without altering the systemic conditions that had birthed them. The question soon emerged: could peace built on shallow reforms truly endure? Remaining economic struggles. While the reduction in taxation provided a sense of relief, it quickly became evident that the underlying economic hardships remained untouched. The Agbekoya movement had not merely been about tax burdens, it was rooted in a broader demand for structural equity access to land, fair governance, and a sustainable agricultural economy. Despite the promises of reform, the agricultural sector continued to struggle. Centuries-old farming techniques, underinvestment in rural development, and poor market access hampered productivity. Many farmers remained landless or were unable to reclaim lands lost to colonial expropriation or inherited debts. Critically, the peace agreement made no meaningful provision for land redistribution, a key demand of the Agbekoya struggle. The absence of land reform meant that many farmers remained economically insecure, tilling borrowed soil with limited rights and uncertain futures. Furthermore, the broader system of economic exploitation remained intact. Farmers, dependent on volatile cash crops such as cocoa, remained at the mercy of fluctuating global markets. Lacking access to modern farming tools, credit facilities, and storage infrastructure, they were often compelled to sell their harvests at a loss. Meanwhile, the government's rural development programs were slow to materialize and unevenly distributed, leaving many communities in continued deprivation. Compounding these challenges was a political elite that remained largely unaccountable and urban-centric in its priorities. Though the state had momentarily yielded to the farmers' demands, its core alignment with urban commercial interests and foreign capital remained unchanged. The Agbekoya farmers found themselves navigating a post-rebellion landscape in which the appearance of reform masked a persistent reality of marginalization. Resilience in the Agbekoya movement. Despite the limitations of the truce, the Agbekoya farmers refused to be broken by disappointment. If the peace agreement revealed the limitations of the state's reformist agenda, it also revealed the enduring spirit of a movement grounded in community solidarity, collective identity, and the unyielding pursuit of justice. The Agbekoya leaders recognized the truce not as a conclusion, but as an interlude, a pause in a longer struggle. They understood that the concessions gained were neither sufficient nor permanent. Yet, rather than resorting to renewed violence, many farmers turned to more strategic forms of resistance: political organizing, local advocacy, and participation in community governance. The post-truce years witnessed a quiet but determined continuation of the Agbekoya ethos. Farmers who had once carried cutlasses and hoes in defiance of unjust taxation now carried their convictions into political forums, local cooperative societies, and civic engagement efforts. The Agbekoya spirit endured not as a militant uprising, but as a persistent demand for justice embedded in the cultural and political consciousness of rural Western Nigeria. Their resilience was not born of naivety, but of clarity. The farmers knew that lasting change would require more than promises, it would require structural transformation, accountability, and sustained pressure on the political system. While the government's reforms may have brought an end to visible unrest, the deeper aspiration of the Agbekoya movement for dignity, fairness, and autonomy remained alive. Chapter 4: Economic War. After the guns, the Battle of Hunger. The guns may have fallen silent, but for the Agbekoya farmers, the struggle continued. The peace settlement and the much-celebrated tax relief offered a temporary pause in the storm, but not a permanent solution. The economic war. The Battle of Hunger persisted long after the political truce was declared. For many farmers, the cessation of violence marked the beginning of another kind of war, one fought in the silence of neglected farmlands, in the gnawing pangs of hunger, and in the continued erosion of dignity through poverty. Although the reduction in taxes was a welcome reprieve, it failed to resolve the deeper issues that had compelled the farmers to rise up. hunger remained their most unyielding adversary. The market volatility of cash crops like cocoa and palm oil made it nearly impossible for smallholder farmers to secure stable incomes. Their economic existence was a tightrope act. One misstep in global pricing, one failed rainy season, or one policy oversight could plunge entire households into starvation. Worse still, their productivity was restrained by poor access to modern tools and agricultural inputs. Outdated farming methods, coupled with a lack of irrigation infrastructure, exposed them to climate uncertainty. With no access to extension services or credit facilities, many farmers were left to survive by subsistence alone. Even where the tax burden had been lifted, the legacy of decades of economic neglect endured. The war of bullets had ended, but the war of hunger raged on. Unsolved structural poverty. The Agbekoya movement had drawn national attention to the plight of the Yoruba farmer. Yet the post-rebellion period showed how little had changed at the structural level. Poverty remained entrenched, not simply because of taxation, but because of a system that had long denied farmers the means to elevate their condition. Central to this structural poverty was the issue of land tenure. Despite being one of the core grievances of the rebellion, land reform was conspicuously absent from the peace settlement. Farmers continued to operate under insecure land rights, unable to invest confidently in long-term productivity improvements. Many had been left with fragmented plots, a legacy of colonial expropriation and post-colonial mismanagement. Land was not just a means of production, it was identity, inheritance, and hope. Its insecurity made future planning impossible and reinforced cycles of generational poverty. In addition, economic policies still favored urban development and industrial agriculture, sidelining smallholder farmers who formed the backbone of the rural economy. With limited access to markets, financial institutions, and infrastructure, the farmers remained dependent on middlemen who set unfavorable prices and terms. This structural exclusion created a bottleneck that prevented meaningful wealth generation in rural communities. Credit access was another glaring gap. Without collateral often tied to land ownership, farmers were denied loans to expand or improve their operations. This left them vulnerable to exploitative lending practices or forced to sell harvests prematurely at reduced rates. Every planting season became a gamble for survival, not a calculated investment in prosperity. Structural poverty, therefore, remained an unrelenting barrier, keeping rural farmers locked out of Nigeria's broader economic growth. The spirit of economic emancipation. Though their rebellion did not dismantle the economic structures that oppressed them, the Agbekoya farmers awakened a consciousness that refused to die. The spirit of economic emancipation, the belief in a just and equitable economic system, continued to inspire rural resistance and civic advocacy. Their fight was never just about tax, it was about autonomy, opportunity, and the right to thrive on one's own land. This spirit became a mirror for governance in Nigeria. It underscored that reforms, which focus only on symptoms such as reducing taxes without addressing foundational injustices, are insufficient. The Agbekoya demanded a new paradigm, one that respected the dignity of labor, that recognized land as a right and not a privilege, and that placed the well-being of the rural majority at the center of national policy. Their struggle also provided lessons on inclusive development. It reminded policymakers that enduring change requires systemic thinking. Land reform, fair pricing policies, farmer education, access to inputs, and rural financing. These were not luxuries, they were necessities for economic justice. Most importantly, the Agbekoya movement taught that economic resistance does not always wear the face of violence. It can be seen in the persistence of farmers who continue to work their lands despite institutional neglect. It is felt in their insistence on being heard, on being counted, and on being served by the governments they empower with their votes and taxes. The war of hunger was not only about food, it was about freedom. And while the Agbekoya may not have won that war in their lifetime, they lit a flame that future generations would carry forward. Their fight redefined resistance, shifting it from the battlefield to the boardroom, the ballot box, and the courtroom. The guns had gone silent, but the call for economic emancipation continued to echo across the hills and farmlands of western Nigeria. Summary of Volume 3, Wisdom, Diplomacy, and the End of Rebellion. Volume 3 delves into the final stages of the Agbekoya Rebellion, capturing the critical transition from violent resistance to negotiated peace. It examines how the Yoruba peasant farmers, despite being marginalized and under-resourced, strategically used collective strength, cultural solidarity, and grassroots organization to challenge a system that had long exploited them. The volume highlights the interplay between community wisdom and state diplomacy that ultimately brought an end to the open conflict. At the heart of this volume is the recognition that the Agbekoya movement was not merely a protest against tax policies, it was a profound statement against systemic neglect, economic injustice, and political exclusion. The rebellion had exposed the cracks in Nigeria's post-independence governance structure, especially its failure to address rural grievances and its continued use of colonial-era economic models. While the reduction of excessive taxes marked a key achievement, the peace agreement failed to tackle the more entrenched problems that sustained rural poverty. Structural issues such as insecure land tenure, lack of access to capital and agricultural inputs, and outdated farming systems were left largely unaddressed. Consequently, many farmers remained trapped in cycles of hardship even after the guns went silent. The volume further explores how this failure to implement deeper reforms rendered the victory partial. Though peace was restored, the core of the farmers' demands, economic emancipation, land reform, and inclusive governance, remained unresolved. The Agbekoya's efforts, however, left a lasting legacy. They had shown that the power of the people, when organized and resolute, could compel the state to act. The government's eventual shift from repression to negotiation is presented as a critical lesson in leadership. The volume emphasizes the importance of listening to the concerns of the governed, especially those at the margins of society. It underscores how the decision to pursue dialogue, rather than rely solely on military force, prevented a prolonged conflict and laid the groundwork for temporary relief. Key lessons emerge from this period. Wisdom in resistance. The farmers employed strategic patience, community values, and moral clarity in advancing their cause, proving that even the most overlooked citizens could challenge the status quo. Diplomacy over force. The eventual decision by state actors to open dialogue and negotiate a peaceful settlement demonstrated the superiority of diplomacy over violent suppression. Incomplete justice. The volume stresses that without structural economic reforms, especially in land ownership, rural finance, and agricultural development, true justice and sustainable peace remain elusive. Volume 4. From Rebellion to Reflection. Leadership Lessons for the Future. Introduction to Volume 4. In the wake of conflict and rebellion, there often emerges an invaluable moment for reflection, understanding, and purposeful transformation. Agbekoya, the rebellion against oppression. Lessons in leadership, governance, and inclusive development has traced the powerful journey of a people's resistance, charting the rise, peak, and resolution of one of Nigeria's most impactful agrarian uprisings. It has captured not just the events, but the emotions, motivations, and socio-political dynamics that fueled the Agbekoya Rebellion. Now, as the final chapter of this historic narrative unfolds, what remains are not merely accounts of struggle, but profound insights, echoes of wisdom that demand our attention. Volume 4, From Rebellion to Reflection, Leadership Lessons for the Future, marks a pivotal shift in the series. It steps beyond the immediacy of protest and reform, looking inward toward the deeper meanings and lasting implications of leadership. What kind of leadership sustains peace after conflict? What governance structures prevent the recurrence of discontent? How can the voices of ordinary citizens become integral to national development? These are the questions that frame this volume. Rather than revisiting the external conditions that led to the rebellion, this final volume turns the spotlight on leadership itself, on how authority is exercised, how leaders respond to dissent, and how governance systems must evolve to include rather than exclude. The Agbekoya farmers did not merely rise against taxes or hardship, they rose against a system that silenced them. Their movement was both a cry for justice and a call for inclusive, responsive leadership. Chapter 1, When Citizens Speak, The Cry of the Masses. Throughout history, pivotal change has often been driven not by those in positions of power, but by the collective voices of the people, those at the grassroots level whose lived realities too often go unacknowledged. The Agbekoya Rebellion stands as one such defining moment, where the cry of the rural masses broke through the silence of governmental indifference. These were not spontaneous outbursts of anger. They were deeply rooted in years of hardship, marginalization, and an unrelenting desire for justice. In southwestern Nigeria during the late 1960s, the Agbekoya farmers, predominantly Yoruba, faced excessive taxation, bureaucratic overreach, and the absence of basic infrastructure. Their lands, livelihoods, and dignity were under siege by a system that taxed them without representation and governed without understanding their pain. What began as isolated grumblings in villages soon crescendoed into a region-wide protest, a rebellion sparked not by politics, but by survival. The Agbekoya farmers, often labeled as rebels, were in truth citizens who had exhausted every peaceful means of engagement. Petitions were ignored, appeals were dismissed, and traditional leaders were compromised. In that vacuum of leadership and empathy, a movement was born not out of hatred for the state, but out of desperation to be heard. Their cry was not just against taxes, it was against a system that had grown deaf to the very people it claimed to serve. Ignored warnings and consequences. Rebellions rarely emerge without warning. They are typically the end result of a prolonged series of ignored signs, protests overlooked, grievances trivialized, and frustrations left to fester. In the case of the Agbekoya Rebellion, the Western Nigerian government failed to recognize or respond to the rising tide of rural unrest. The farmers had long expressed dissatisfaction through various peaceful channels. Local meetings, traditional forums, and even correspondence with government officials. But their voices were systematically marginalized. This chapter examines the consequences of ignoring these early warnings. By turning a blind eye to the warning signs, the government inadvertently laid the groundwork for a larger crisis. Rather than proactively engaging with the farmers, they relied on intimidation and coercion measures that only deepened the divide. The farmers' patience waned, their pleas turned into protests, and their silence into resistance. The lesson here is universal. When governments neglect the voices of the people, especially those most affected by policy decisions, they create conditions ripe for rebellion. A state that does not listen risks alienating its own citizens, weakening the social contract, and opening the door to instability. True leadership is not tested in moments of peace, but in how it responds to dissent, especially dissent that comes with legitimate demands. Power of grassroots movements. The Agbekoya Rebellion is a striking example of how grassroots movements can rise from the margins and shake the very foundations of power. It was not an elite-driven revolution, nor one masterminded by urban intellectuals or political parties. It was a farmers' movement built on unity, conviction, and an unyielding sense of injustice. These were men and women who had little in terms of wealth or formal education, but who understood their rights and refused to be trampled. Grassroots movements possess a unique power, the power of authenticity. Unlike top-down reforms, they grow organically from the lived experiences of ordinary people. Their strength lies in numbers, solidarity, and the moral force of their cause. The Agbekoya farmers were not driven by ideology, but by the tangible need for justice and fairness. And because their cause was just, their movement resonated far beyond their immediate communities. Such movements serve as a wake-up call to leaders. Governance must be inclusive, participatory, and responsive. When citizens at the grassroots are ignored, they do not disappear. They organize. They gather strength. They find common ground. And when they move with a power that can redraw the boundaries of what is possible in public policy. The Agbekoya Rebellion forced not just the Western region, but the entire Nigerian Federation to re-evaluate how it engaged with rural populations. It highlighted the necessity of dialogue, equity in taxation, and accountability in governance. While the rebellion itself may have had its share of losses and sacrifices, it succeeded in amplifying the voice of the forgotten. It demonstrated that when citizens speak with unity and clarity of purpose, even the most entrenched systems must respond or risk collapse. Chapter 2. Crisis Management. As the Agbekoya Rebellion escalated, the government's response was swift and uncompromising. A militarized approach, rooted in suppression and force, took center stage in an attempt to quell the uprising. However, this heavy-handed response failed to address the root causes of the rebellion and instead exacerbated tensions, alienating even more of the population. This chapter explores a critical question. Could the government have handled the crisis differently? What alternative approaches might have led to a more peaceful resolution, one that avoided the loss of lives, resources, and goodwill? The answers lie in examining the tools of crisis management, including diplomacy, mediation, and understanding the underlying dynamics of the rebellion. Leadership during a crisis requires more than just reacting to immediate threats. It involves foresight, empathy, and a willingness to listen and engage with those who are suffering. The Agbekoya Rebellion serves as a cautionary tale about what happens when leadership fails to recognize the power of dialogue and alternative approaches to crisis management. By analyzing the government's response, we can uncover missed opportunities and extract valuable lessons for current and future leaders. Missed alternatives by leaders. The Agbekoya Rebellion was not an isolated or spontaneous incident. It was the culmination of long-standing economic hardship, governmental neglect, and social injustice, particularly among the agrarian communities of the Yoruba region. Yet despite these warning signs, the government responded primarily through military means, missing several crucial opportunities for peaceful engagement. One of the foremost alternatives would have been early dialogue with the leaders of the Agbekoya movement. Instead Instead of allowing tensions to escalate into open conflict, the government could have reached out to the farmers to better understand their grievances. Central to their protest were complaints about oppressive taxation, land tenure, insecurity, and lack of basic infrastructure and support. Opening communication channels early before the rebellion gained momentum could have allowed for mediation, negotiation, and possible compromise. Involving traditional institutions could have served as a major bridge in facilitating that conversation. The Yoruba society has long depended on its traditional rulers, elders, and local influences to maintain social order. Leveraging their influence would have created a culturally accepted platform for addressing grievances. These respected figures could have acted as intermediaries, fostering trust and allowing the farmers to feel heard and represented. Moreover, reforming the taxation system was another realistic and missed opportunity. The core complaint of many farmers was not simply that they were taxed, but that they were taxed unjustly. Taxes were often imposed without proper consultation or regard for the farmer's capacity to pay. The government could have initiated a participatory tax reform process that included the voices of the rural farmers, agricultural economists, and regional planners. Such reforms could have demonstrated government goodwill and helped prevent violent escalation. Finally, the government had the option of showing commitment through rural investment and development. The farmers weren't only rebelling because of taxation, they were expressing frustration at the absence of government support in their day-to-day struggles. The roads were poor, irrigation systems inadequate, and access to markets limited. A comprehensive rural development plan could have signaled to the farmers that their lives and livelihoods mattered to the state. Such investment would have acted as a preventive mechanism, reducing the appeal of rebellion and fostering cooperation. Mediation versus militarism. When the rebellion broke out, the state defaulted to one of the oldest responses in crisis: suppression. Troops and police were deployed, arrests were made, and homes were raided. The government sought to crush dissent through intimidation and force. Yet, this militaristic approach only deepened the resentment and disconnection between the government and the people. While order may have been temporarily restored, it was at the cost of long-term trust and stability. History, however, offers us a more sustainable path: mediation. Mediation involves engaging neutral third parties to facilitate dialogue between conflicting groups. In the context of Agbekoya, traditional rulers such as the Obas, respected elders, and even local religious leaders could have played this mediatory role. These figures held legitimacy within their communities and had the capacity to interpret both the grievances of the farmers and the concerns of the government. Their involvement could have led to a mutual understanding and possibly prevented the bloodshed that followed. A key feature of mediation is restoring broken trust. In any rebellion, the social contract between the governed and their leaders is ruptured. Mediation, when properly facilitated, allows each party to articulate its position and work toward mutual respect and compromise. In the Agbekoya crisis, the government's failure to introduce mediators or provide a neutral forum for discussion contributed to the collapse of dialogue. Moreover, mediation allows for creative, less confrontational solutions. While military force eliminates the symptom of rebellion, mediation addresses the cause. For example, a skilled mediator might have proposed a tax deferment program tied to agricultural seasons or a farmer cooperative initiative that gave local farmers more control over pricing and production. These would have served as tangible steps toward economic justice and restored dignity to the affected communities. The contrast is clear. Militarism seeks compliance. Mediation seeks understanding. The former creates creates silence, the latter builds consensus. In the Agbekoya Rebellion, the latter could have transformed confrontation into collaboration. What history could have taught. The government's response to the Agbekoya Rebellion was neither unprecedented nor without alternatives. History both within and beyond Nigeria offers powerful lessons on the value of dialogue over dominance. During the Nigerian Civil War, 1967 to 1970, for instance, initial military strategies failed to yield peace. It was only when diplomatic channels were opened that the path to reconciliation began. Similarly, the end of apartheid in South Africa, the peace processes in Northern Ireland, and the post-colonial transitions across Africa all demonstrate one thing: dialogue works. Had the government approached the Agbekoya movement with the lessons of history in mind, it would have recognized the long-term value of negotiation over suppression. Rather than seeing farmers as enemies of the state, it could have acknowledged them as citizens with legitimate demands. A collaborative tone, rather than an authoritarian one, could have shifted the national mood from rebellion to reform. Ultimately, history shows that force may achieve short-term control, but only justice secures lasting peace. The Agbekoya Rebellion stands today not just as a rural uprising, but as a testimony to what leadership could have done differently and what future leaders must do to avoid repeating the mistakes of the past. Chapter 3. Leadership Wisdom. Lessons for Modern Governance. Reforming Policy with Empathy Building. Foresight in Leadership. The past as a mirror for the future. The Agbekoya Rebellion of the 1960s stands as a powerful testament to the dangers of ignoring people's needs, dismissing their grievances, and failing to address systemic issues within society. Born out of the oppression faced by farmers in Western Nigeria, the rebellion was not just a protest, it was a pivotal reflection on the failures of leadership and governance. The insights drawn from the Agbekoya movement offer modern leaders timeless guidance on how to govern justly, empathetically, and wisely. As the world grapples with economic inequality, political instability, and civic unrest, leaders today must look back to look forward. The Agbekoya experience is not merely a historical event, but a mirror that reflects the consequences of leadership disconnected from its people. In this chapter, we explore actionable lessons for modern governance, highlight the need for empathy in policy reform, and underscore the strategic value of foresight in leadership. Lessons for modern governance. One of the enduring lessons from the Agbekoya Rebellion is that effective governance starts with understanding the realities of the people. When policies are made in isolation, without a firm grasp of grassroots struggles, they risk becoming tools of oppression rather than instruments of development. During the rebellion, the government's imposition of heavy taxes on already marginalized farmers without corresponding infrastructural or economic support triggered deep unrest. Instead of addressing farmers' legitimate grievances, the leadership chose suppression, a decision that only worsened the crisis. Modern governance must move beyond elitism and bureaucratic detachment. Leaders today must engage deeply with the socio-economic fabrics of the communities they serve. This involves building policy on data gathered through community engagement and consultation, identifying pressure points before they explode into unrest, actively dismantling institutional systems that perpetuate inequality. A government that listens learns. A government that learns leads. Reforming policy with empathy. Empathy is not weakness, it is leadership strength. The Agbekoya Rebellion teaches us that when empathy is absent from policymaking, discontent grows in silence until it erupts in rebellion. The farmers' discontent was not merely about tax rates. It was about a deep sense of invisibility, of being used for their produce while being denied essential services like roads, water, healthcare, and education. Their work sustained the region, yet they remained locked in poverty. Modern leaders must design economic and social policies through the lens of empathy, especially for the underserved. This includes 1. Progressive and fair taxation. Tax systems must not disproportionately burden the poor. Modern policy must consider economic realities and design taxes that are equitable, redistributive, and responsive. 2. Inclusive economic growth. Invest in rural economies and marginalized communities. Development must be balanced, not concentrated in urban centers so that no group is left behind. 3. Support for agriculture. Given agriculture's continued relevance in developing economies, leaders should support farmers with I. Access to credit 2, fair land policies 3, infrastructure for storage, and market access 4. Modern farming technology and inputs 4. Social welfare and safety nets. Empathetic policies recognize that life is unpredictable. Welfare programs, e.g. food support, education subsidies, health insurance, provide dignity and resilience in hard times. 5. Sustainability and long-term vision. Reform must be future-oriented. Economic systems must be built on sustainability, both environmental and financial, so that they endure for generations. Empathetic policy reform also means engaging with those affected by decisions before those decisions are finalized. Let the people co-create the policies that shape their lives. Building foresight in leadership. The failure of foresight was a major flaw in the leadership that preceded the Agbekoya Rebellion. There were clear warning signs, grumblings in villages, meetings among farmers, declining agricultural output, but they were ignored. Foresight is the capacity to detect the storm before it breaks. For modern leaders, foresight is not optional, it is essential. Key strategies to build foresight include active listening, creating platforms like town halls or feedback portals where citizens can express their concerns, early warning systems, monitoring economic, social, and environmental indicators that hint at brewing unrest, strategic scenario planning, using data and historical patterns to simulate possible future developments, continuous policy evaluation. Policies should be flexible, not fixed. Leaders must be willing to reassess and reform in response to evolving conditions. Moreover, foresight demands collaboration with experts, civil society organizations, community leaders, and academia. No one person, no matter how visionary, can predict all outcomes. Wisdom lies in collective foresight. Chapter 4. Toward inclusive development, where do we go from here? The road to progress. The Agbekoya Rebellion, like other pivotal uprisings in history, serves as a stark reminder of what happens when leadership fails to address the systemic challenges facing its people. It was not just about resisting taxation, it was a deeper call against neglect, exclusion, and oppression. A call against a system that thrived at the expense of the very people it was meant to serve. As we envision the future, the pressing question remains, where do we go from here? How do we move from a cycle of reactionary governance to one of proactive, inclusive development? This chapter outlines the way forward, highlighting key strategies to prevent economic oppression, promote participatory governance, and encourage leadership that balances power with empathy. Empowering the people. Economic empowerment is the foundation of inclusive development. Without it, citizens remain trapped in cycles of poverty, disillusionment, and disengagement. The Agbekoya Rebellion revealed consequences of economic policies that exploit rather than uplift, especially in agrarian societies where the majority relied on farming to survive. To create lasting change, modern governments must pursue policies that do not merely alleviate short-term pain but establish long-term economic dignity and independence. Empowering people economically means creating a system where every citizen has the opportunity to thrive irrespective of location, background, or social class. 1. Fair taxation. Systems. Equity in taxation is critical. A progressive tax system ensures that the burden of revenue generation does not fall unfairly on the poor. Those who earn more contribute more, while vulnerable populations are shielded from excessive financial strain. Such a system promotes fairness and social cohesion. 2. Access to productive resources. True empowerment comes from access. Citizens must have equitable access to the tools that allow them to participate in economic lifeland: credit, education, healthcare, and technology. For farmers, this means access to quality seeds, affordable fertilizers, equipment, and training in climate-smart agriculture. Without such access, potential is stifled. 3. Infrastructure and rural investment governments must stop treating rural development as secondary. Roads, water, electricity, digital connectivity, and marketplaces must reach even the remotest communities. The concentration of development in urban areas fuels migration, unemployment, and inequality. Rural economies must be made viable and competitive. 4th. Social safety nets. Empowerment also means protecting people from falling through the cracks. When crisis strikes, be it economic, environmental, or personal, social protection systems such as unemployment insurance, pension schemes, and targeted subsidies can prevent a slide into destitution. These measures are not acts of charity, but smart investments in human security. When people are economically empowered, they are better able to engage in civic life, demand accountability, and contribute meaningfully to national progress. Participatory governance empowerment without voice is incomplete. A system that empowers citizens economically but mutes their voices in decision-making will still fail. The Agbekoya farmers rebelled, not only because they were overtaxed, but because they had no platform through which to seek redress. Their grievances were met with silence, or worse, with force. Participatory governance ensures that power is not hoarded at the top, but shared across every layer of society. It moves us from ruling to leading, from dictating to listening. It recognizes that policies are more effective and legitimate when shaped by those they affect. 1. Beyond the ballot, continuous engagement. Democracy must extend beyond elections. Regular town hall meetings, community consultations, referenda, and open forums help close the gap between leaders and the people. These platforms allow citizens to express opinions, suggest alternatives, and hold government accountable between voting seasons. 2. Decentralization and local autonomy. One of the most practical ways to enhance participation is through decentralization. Local governments, when empowered with financial resources and decision-making authority, are better positioned to address grassroots issues. People are more likely to engage when decisions affecting them are made closer to home. 3. Inclusion of marginalized groups. Genuine participation requires that all voices are heard, not just those of the elite. Women, youth, persons with disabilities, rural dwellers, and minority ethnic groups must be intentionally included in public dialogue and policy formulation. Affirmative measures may be needed to ensure these groups are not sidelined. 4th. Civic education and political literacy. A participatory system cannot function if citizens are unaware of their rights or how to exercise them. Civic education integrated into school curricula and community programs should teach people how government works, how to vote, how to demand transparency, and how to contribute to national development. An informed citizenry is the best safeguard against tyranny. Participation is not a threat to authority, it is its greatest strength. Leaders who govern with the people rather than over them foster unity, innovation, and trust, balancing power with compassion. Authority without empathy breeds fear. Leadership without compassion fosters rebellion. At the core of the Agbekoya uprising was the government's inability or unwillingness to listen, to understand, and to respond with humanity. The farmers were met not with dialogue, but with bullets. Today's leaders must learn from that failure. The best leaders are not those who impose order through fear, but those who inspire it through trust. Compassion does not make leadership weak, it makes it sustainable. 1. Active listening and open dialogue. Empathetic leadership begins with a willingness to listen. This means not just formal hearings, but genuine, informal engagement with communities. Listening to people's stories, fears, and hopes helps bridge the emotional distance between ruler and ruled. 2. Trust building and transparency. Trust is the currency of effective governance. Leaders build trust when they are honest, consistent, and responsive. Admitting mistakes, correcting them, and communicating transparently can win more support than pretending to be infallible. 3. Informed and inclusive. Decision-making leaders must resist the temptation to make unilateral decisions. A wise leader surrounds himself with a diverse team, technical experts, grassroots leaders, youth voices, and considers multiple perspectives before taking action. Empathy is not just an emotion, it is an analytical tool that considers the human cost of every decision. 4. Non-violent conflict resolution. A hallmark of compassionate leadership is the preference for peace over force. In moments of crisis, the first response should be dialogue, not deployment. Mediation, negotiation, and restorative justice are more sustainable than coercion. Reconciliation efforts should be institutionalized to heal national wounds and prevent cyclical violence. Balancing power with compassion is the future of leadership. It demands emotional intelligence, cultural sensitivity, and the courage to see one's subjects not as obstacles, but as partners in development. Conclusion: a new social contract. The path to inclusive development lies in rebuilding the social contract, one where power is exercised responsibly, citizens are treated with dignity, and governance is grounded in justice. The Agbekoya Rebellion must never be seen as a mere episode in history, but as a living lesson. It reminds us that societies fail, not because they lack resources, but because they ignore their people. Empowering the people, promoting participatory governance, and balancing authority with empathy are not ideals, they are necessities. If we are to avoid repeating the mistakes of the past, these must become the pillars of our leadership ethos. Only then can we move forward toward a future where no citizen is left behind, and where development truly. Summary of Volume 4. Toward Inclusive Development. Agbekoya was more than a rebellion. It was a message. True leadership listens, adapts, and uplifts. Volume 4 explores the deeper implications of the Agbekoya Rebellion, revealing it not merely as a protest against oppressive taxation, but as a broader indictment of systemic failure in leadership and governance. It positions the rebellion as a powerful historical lesson, one that calls for introspection and transformation in the structures of power. The volume argues inclusive development cannot occur in a vacuum of empathy or participation. Economic oppression, political marginalization, and authoritarian leadership are all catalysts for unrest when left unaddressed. Therefore, modern leaders must move beyond rhetoric and implement policies that foster equity, opportunity, and meaningful engagement with all segments of society. The first section, Empowering the People, emphasizes the need to dismantle structures that perpetuate poverty and exclusion. It advocates for progressive taxation, access to education and resources, rural investment, and robust social safety nets tools that give marginalized citizens a fair chance to succeed. In participatory governance, the narrative shifts toward the mechanisms of inclusion. Leadership, it asserts, must be transparent, accountable, and open to dialogue. This includes decentralization of authority, civic education, community-based consultations, and inclusive policymaking that reflects the diverse realities of the governed. Finally, balancing power with compassion underscores the moral responsibility of leaders to wield authority not with force, but with wisdom and empathy. It highlights the importance of listening, trust building, peaceful conflict resolution, and making decisions that serve the common good, rather than entrenched privilege. Taken together, these themes articulate a new vision for governance, one where power is shared, development is people-centered, and leadership is redefined not by control, but by compassion and service. The legacy of Agbekoya, as shown in this volume, is not just a memory of resistance, but a mandate for future reform. Final reflections. The Agbekoya legacy, a timeless compass for leadership, governance, and social change. The Agbekoya Rebellion was not just an uprising, it was a profound statement from the margins of society. It was a loud, unrelenting demand for justice, dignity, and inclusive governance. As this series of volumes has shown, Agbekoya was more than a movement of farmers. It was a movement of conscience, offering a timeless compass for those seeking to understand leadership, social transformation, and the responsibilities of governance. What would an Agbekoya response look like today? If a modern-day Agbekoya were to arise, it would not simply be a protest in the fields, it would be a multi-layered outcry from disenfranchised populations across digital platforms, city streets, rural communities, and global diasporas. Today's version of Agbekoya would blend grassroots activism with civic tech, social movements with policy critique, and local struggles with international attention. It would speak against structural inequality, economic marginalization, abuse of power, and the silence of leadership in the face of social decay. In a world where injustices persist in different forms, the Agbekoya spirit would demand bold reforms, not band-aid solutions. How do we protect people's voices in modern governance? The challenge of contemporary governance lies in ensuring that power is not distant from the people it claims to serve. Agbekoya teaches us that silence in the corridors of power breeds rebellion on the streets. Protecting people's voices means establishing participatory frameworks that go beyond tokenism town halls, civic platforms, local government empowerment, and laws that guarantee freedom of speech and protection for dissenters. It means educating citizens about their rights and equipping them with the tools to hold leaders accountable. The legacy of Agbekoya reminds us that when people have no peaceful means to be heard, unrest becomes the language of the unheard. What enduring lessons must leaders adopt in Africa and beyond? The Agbekoya legacy offers enduring lessons that stretch beyond Western Nigeria and across continents. It teaches that governance must be people-centered, leadership must be servant-driven, and development must be inclusive. Leaders must listen deeply to those at the margins, prioritize justice over political expediency, balance authority with empathy, decentralize power to bring government closer to the people, foster economic systems that uplift rather than exploit. These lessons are not just idealistic, they are pragmatic necessities for societies that hope to thrive in the 21st century. From Lagos to Johannesburg, Nairobi to New York, the core message is the same. When leadership fails to listen, people will find their voice in resistance. A closing thought. The Agbekoya Rebellion may have been a moment in history, but its message is eternal. In a world still struggling with inequality, corruption, and exclusion, Agbekoya calls on us to reimagine leadership not as dominance, but as duty. It invites us to see governance not as control, but as service. And it challenges every generation to stand for justice, dignity, and the shared humanity that binds us all. Agbekoya lives not in rebellion for rebellion's sake, but as a blueprint for the Africa we must build. This concludes Agbekoya, A People's Movement for Justice and Dignity, written by Adedeji Jones Adesamoye. Thank you for listening. If this story moved you, challenged you, or inspired deeper reflection, please consider sharing it with others or leaving a review. To stay updated on future volumes or related publications, follow official channels or publications where this work is made available. Let us carry forward the legacy of those who stood for dignity and justice, not with weapons, but with wisdom, unity, and unwavering conviction. Thank you once again.